Hello, everybody. I'm Sudeshna from MARG Business Transformation, and a warm welcome to all of you to join the webinar on this very pertinent topic of cognitive diversity during crisis and after. MARG Business Transformation. We are a 12-year-old corporate training and consulting firm. Our verticals include and specialize in leadership development, change management, consulting, fintech, and a few niche technical trainings as well. We indeed do very many things and different things as well. But what underlines all of them is our endeavor in helping organizations and leaders to translate their learning into making changes in their workplace. We consider ourselves successful only when you are able to apply the learnings at your workplace and translate them into actionable items. Today's topic shall be delivered by Krish. Krish is the speaker. She is the founder and director of MARG. He has been pivotal in playing very important roles in organizations, earlier as a leader and now as a consultant in the areas of org development, culture, changes in teams and organization. In MARG's journey in building organization capability, we work with various organizations globally to bring this to our to India and to organizations here. Today, you shall find Krish combining knowledge on change management, human thinking and behavior, and organization culture, and apply it to cognitive diversity. So over to you, Krish.
Thank you, Sudeshna. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm hoping that this 1 hour is going to be very, as Sudeshna said, actionable for you. We are dealing with a topic that's one part of the sentence, leverage cognitive diversity, is a little too abstract. And the other part, during crisis and after, is very real, it's very tangible. And we're hoping that in this next 1 hour, we'll be able to connect the dots for you. Why this topic? Where does this come from? Well, the during crisis and after is where all of us are. Right? I've grown a little sick and tired of the phrase new normal. No one knows what that newness is going to be, and we don't know when the normality is going to actually turn up. Right? I read a more recent article that talked about the next normal, and that sounded a little more reasonable to me. That we're going to be running at quite a few normals before we settle down and say, okay, looks like this is the way it's going to run. So that's the second part. The second part is, as an organization, in our roles in an organization, as we look around what's happening, how do we connect up to what we need to do now and then later? How will that story come together? That's one part of the equation we're trying to answer. The first part, cognitive diversity. Diversity is something we've run into in very many contexts, and we're going to go down that path a little more during this conversation on what is that diversity. What is the dynamic of diversity? Cognitive. Perhaps you're in the game and you know how cognitive works. You're in the HR field. You've been into behavioral psychology and cognitive psychology and God knows what all. And that word is familiar to you. Perhaps it's not. Let me take you through my own journey as I first heard the word. And the way I parse it in my brain is, someone offers me an apple. Something in my brain helps me figure out it's an apple. Its shape, its color, its smell, possibly how hungry I am, mixture of things, all help me figure out that it is an apple. But my journey to call it an apple and recognize it as such doesn't stop there. I take it, I bite into it, and how crunchy is it? How crisp is it? What kind of taste does it have? Is it ripe? Is it unripe? There's a whole busy machinery happening up here, which helps us figure out what is that thing. And more important, is that thing, what is the thing to us? What is our relation with the thing? Good, bad, ugly. Do I take it and continue eating it? Do I take it and chuck it at someone? Do I take it and say, oh, this was really bad? How do I react to that apple? How do I deal with that apple? So what you have here in what I described is the cognitive part of it, the cognition part of it, the recognition part of it, where I'm trying to figure out, what is this apple? Is this an apple? What is this apple? And what is this apple to me? And then comes the game, and that's why this is very, very important to us. Then comes the decisions that thinking, that cognition, that recognition that it's an apple, the good apple, it's a bad apple. What do I do with that? That's where the game starts for us in an organization. In an organization, if instead of an apple, it was an email, you're looking at it, you're scanning through your inbox, and there's an email that pops up. It's an email from a stakeholder. It's an email from a stakeholder who's not been happy with you. It's an email from a stakeholder with whom most recently your team has not delivered something. It's an email from a stakeholder in context of a team that's not delivered something, who was pretty senior up the hierarchy. And as I took you through this storyline of different things that stakeholder and that email is, you are already building up a thought process around that mail. Even before you opened it, before you're acting on it, before you know what that email is. I'm not even talking to the subject line. Cognition is an important part for us as professionals to understand, leave alone as leaders. And in that field too, we need diversity. And that's the first part of the storyline. How do I leverage having people who have different ways in which they figure out what that apple is and what that email is? What does it mean to me? How do I gain by it? And to understand that in that 1 hour that we have, which is shrinking as I speak, we are going to go through understanding what are some typical behaviors that are coming up during these times. Number one. Number two, trying to figure out what does this mean to us? How do we take this complex stuff, apples and stuff we can't talk about to others, right? Apples and emails. So how do you set it up? How do you, in our own heads, have a metaphor for what that means? And finally, what's happening around us? What are some people doing and not doing in this area? Those are the things that we want to cover in this 1 hour. How are we going to do it? It's obviously, we are technology dependent at this point. Not a bad thing, but that's where we are. So a couple of requests. First, during this 1 hour, as and when you run into technical questions, please put it into the chat window versus any questions on the topic itself, on what we're discussing itself, we request that you put it in the Q&A window. Besides this, as always, this is a MARG webinar, so we are going to get you to do work. A sheet of paper is definitely useful to have around you because from time to time, I'm going to ask you questions, ask you to note down stuff and so on and so forth. So please have a paper next to you, something to write on, something to capture your thoughts on. And finally, we use Poll EV. We use Poll EV for making sure there's not a one-way conversation. What the hell is Poll EV? What is Poll EV? Sorry. What is Poll EV? Poll EV is a mechanism through which you can enter something on your, say, a phone, browser, or you're in a comp in another browser tab. And when you enter something into this particular URL, right, pollev.com/marktransform, it appears for us on the comp. So on the comp, as in the display will change and we'll take up all the inputs that you guys are providing. So for example, I'm going to open up a poll which talks about what brought you to this topic. So my request to all of you is, can you open a browser, preferably on a phone or some other device, and go to that link, pollev.com/marktransform. You should see a text window. Could you type in what brought you to this topic? What is it about this topic that interests you?
The URL has been tapped, is on your chat window as well. You can click on the URL on your chat window, everybody.
It's pollev.com/marktransform. Yes, the fact that we are all looking for answers, and it's one of the things that's behavior pattern that's turning up as we go through this whole cycle. This is not something we run into before, have we? And for me, what's different about what we're going through is the fact that all of a sudden there is a new common variable between where our business life and our personal life used to have clear boundaries. And that common variable is our wellness. All of a sudden, our individual and collective wellness has become an area of interest for business, for organization, as well as for personal life. Wow, that's something very, very different, right? It's never been. I can't remember it happening in such scale and globally at the same time. Um, Getting leaders to react and connect to the problem, getting them to think about a problem similarly, getting them to even appreciate a problem is a challenge. And it's not about vilifying leaders, it's about the fact that leaders get many things on their tables. How do you help them look at a problem together and then figure out what happens next? Cognitive diversity should be discussed all the time. Why is it so special during crisis? Absolutely fair question. No, it's not. It's not special at any one time or the other. Any form of diversity, any form of organizational wellness, bigger picture, right? It's like CSR. It should be true any time at all. But if you have a CSR plan during an earthquake, and you have teams that are going to help in the earthquake, there is a special meaning over the CSR activity, both for the people who received that as well as people who provided that. For me, the biggest part about cognitive diversity is in this time of crisis, it's all of a sudden got promoted to something that I can't do without. I could leverage it before, but frankly, now it's got far more serious. Is this for HR only? I'm probably going to play that question back to you at the end of this conversation. Does this go beyond HR? Other things that we're going to talk about in this one are about the HR, the function, or about human beings, right? If it's about human beings, then we as business leaders, everyone is involved. But if it's just about HR, perhaps it's limited. So thank you for sharing that. This gives me a flavor of where you are, and it gives us collectively a flavor of who all are with us in this webinar. Let me jump into the topic. The first thing that we must admit, we must consider is anything we talk in this 1 hour is going to be with the backdrop of an organization's culture. The organization's culture, the shared views and the beliefs and the values that the organization has, together go to make the fabric of the organization. And it is on that fabric that we work with each other, interact with each other, paint any change, paint any crisis, paint any response that we want. It's the backdrop, it's the canvas. We work on that culture to get the results we want. So what? What's the big deal? Well, we use human synergistics to go beyond acknowledging the existence of culture. We sit and measure culture. I'll not go into the details of it. That's relevant for this conversation. But we measure culture. We are able to come up with a number, and that number gives us, it's like a vector, right? It gives me both the direction and the magnitude. In this case, it gives me a sense of what kind of a culture do I have. It breaks up possible cultures into 12 different categories, and there are 3 different clusters. And it helps me figure out that, hey, guess what? There is possibly one cluster, which is what we call passive defensive, where the focus is primarily about people. And when I say primarily about people, it's primarily about people at the cost potentially of tasks. It's all about the fact that the relationships are the most important element. We have clients who have this kind of culture, and typically conversations in the organization are more about not rocking the boat, or are about not upsetting other people, are about not allowing other people to lose face. It's about making sure that in a group discussion, cross-functional discussion, no one says anything that's going to freak everyone out. A lot of pre-conversations and a lot of post-conversations. Things take time to get done. There's a second cluster, and this second cluster we call aggressive defensive. And in this cluster, it's all about the tasks. The tasks rule. In fact, it's our abilities with the tasks that make us senior, that make us more visible, that make us more powerful. So this could be where we have clients who demonstrate this culture. It's more about the fact that hierarchy makes a difference. The kind of projects you do make a difference. The kind of expertise you have makes a difference. The kind of clinical precision you have about doing a job perfectly right gives you a lot of status. As you can guess, here it's more of a task focus, and it's primarily task focus. You don't have the people focus you need. And then we have the third cluster, which we call the constructive cluster. And here you have more of it's a balanced focus on task and people. It's more about making sure that people do achieve the things that they individually want and they collectively want, while we make sure that the tasks also get done. So in cultures that we take those earlier clients, we take them towards a constructive culture. Here, I can challenge, and it's always a topic, it's always the issue and never the person. Here, it's about me coming to you and saying, I see you struggling with it. Can I help you with it? This is an environment where feedback is constructive. This is an environment where people are encouraged to grow, and failure is not a thing at all. It's everything's learning. So these are three clusters into which we see clients fall as we measure where they are in their cultural journey. So it's a journey. Now here's the deal, right? As the picture shows, very often all organizations would like to have as constructive a storyline as possible, but in reality, very often organizations fall into one or other of these clusters. And here's the point, connecting back to where we are. We have all gone into the pandemic with the kind of culture we had. This pandemic has made a big difference. The COVID-19 storyline, everything that we're going through on the crisis actually has brought many of us together, has made organizations work more cohesively, more collaboratively. Nevertheless, there is an underlying culture that we've gone into as we went into this crisis. On poll EV, I have a question for you. What should turn up on your screen, if I'm lucky? Thank God. Okay. What should turn up on your device, on your screen, should be this image. Could you please drop a pin on which of these clusters your organization is in? Do you think your organization is more in the passive cluster, where it's all about people, be nice, don't rock the boat? Is it about aggressive defensive on the left side, which is about, hey, get the job done no matter what? Or is it on the top where it's constructive and you're saying, no, it's a balance of both? Could you drop a pin? If you touch your screen or you click your mouse, you should be able to capture where you are in your journey. Just from a contrast perspective, you can drop your pin outside the pie also, near the text. But I can see constructive beginning to turn up. I can see a couple of the early persons calling out both the aggressive culture cluster as well as the passive cluster. I'm waiting for a few more of you to respond. Thank you. And while this comes up, this is a good moment for reflection. This is a good moment for introspection. Push comes to shove, especially during crisis, and that was one of the questions, right? Why now? Why? What's special about the crisis? If you've ever been a part of any crisis response team, or you're going to fly on the wall in leadership, as the leadership works its way through a BCP, there is a certain change in the tone of most conversations as a crisis evolves, develops. The change in tone is often around urgency. The changes in tone is often around not wanting to misunderstand communication. And that can sometimes lean us back to non-constructive clusters. I'm seeing a few responses. I'm going to wait for a few more minutes as more of you respond. Because eventually this webinar is about us wanting to make it as interactive as possible and not just a speech. To the MARG team, is the link available for everyone?
Yes.
On the chat window?
Yes, it has been put in the chat window. Anybody who's
Right.
joined in late, in the chat window, you can go to pollev.com, Mark Transform, and get into this, and you can poll in whatever Krishes, and you can identify what Krishes say. Thank you.
Okay. All right. With that briefing, I have another question for you, still on poll EV. The question for you now is, given that you have that picture in your head, according to you, what qualities would you like your leadership to display during this crisis? So the ask is on your screen. In this area, please place a couple of pins, two taps into next to the words that you think describe what you'd expect of the leadership. And in these, one tap per row, right? Just one pin per row. What do you want leaders to be doing? I see thorough and I see empathetic, absolutely right. You like them to engage, you like them to communicate, makes sense. We want them to be competitive, we want them to welcome change, absolutely. We want them to be logical, we want them to also be creative, but I'm saying empathetic being a very, very important facet, right? We like our leaders to demonstrate this a lot. If I look at the lower rows, I'm seeing a mix in terms of would like them to be introspective, but also speak up as required. Any thoughts on the last two rows? I mean, obviously, take your time and click across, but you need them to be adaptable because the environment is moving pretty fast, isn't it? You need them to be driving too. This is not an environment for complacency. I see that as the thinking over here. I hear you. I still see some pins dropping. Thank you for that. And if we take a step back, what are we saying? What is the picture we want? And this is back to our discussion on cognitive diversity. What are we saying? We need our leaders to be showing very many qualities, not just data oriented, not just about new ideas, not just about getting stuff done. And we definitely want them to take it down to people. We want them to engage well, but also listen. We want them to listen to some extent, but then we want them to do things. We want to get stuff done. And finally, we want to have leaders who are more comfortable with the fact that the environment is going to keep changing than just this. And there isn't a right answer or wrong answer, but this is good input for us. It gives us a flavor of what we are thinking. It gives us a flavor of where our heads are. Like that. I'm going to come back to this at some point. With this in mind, let's go back to our initial question. What are some behaviors we're seeing organizationally? Our biggest challenge during these times is to behave as though nothing happened and go back to our older logic of doing things. And some elements of our older logic included the fact that we said, guess what? People don't really listen well. No, we are seeing that during this time crisis, there is a lot more of a shared view of what is this organization about that's developing. As leaders speak with the organization, as leaders connect with the organization, we are hearing and we are seeing employees being far more participative about what the organization is about. There's far more of a connection. We had a client who was working their way through their typical budgets. And they came back and said, you know what, all those budgets we had for face-to-face meetings and lunches and off-sites for employees, that's lying wasted. Let's go ahead and turn that into something. And the typical organization was a top-down organization and they would have had some XYZ said, this is what we do. They opened it up. They opened it up and asked the organization what would they like. And the organization came back with saying 50% we want for this and 50% we want to put it into a fund. And what did we want as this? They said, please give it to employees who are not having a good home office. Please give it to employees who need furniture in the office. Please give it to employees who need ergonomic help. So this was employees redistributing the opportunity they had, the funding they had. Now, there is a culture that is rebuilding itself as we speak. The second element, which is we are seeing that in the current environment, the teams are acting on what they know, not what they suspect, not what they heard, not what they are figuring out. Yes, there are still the grapevines and there is still an official conversation. But from a culture perspective, strong constructive cultures get formed when we work on objective, known data. And you have an openness in the organization to having the engaged conversation and clarifying things. We are seeing that happen during these times. The third part, and that's probably going to be very, very important for us, is given the fact that people are and the society is dealing with uncertainty, there is a huge need for reinforcement to occur. And we are seeing leaders do that. We are seeing a lot of leaders step up and engage. Leaders who are introverted, leaders who do only emails, leaders who only stand in town halls and nod their heads are having conversations. are having electronic face-to-face conversations. They are approachable, they are available. That said, never has been, at least in my multi-decade working life, never have I seen people and their personal lives and their homes become a factor in much of what we do. That's a big change that's happening. It's changing the way people are working, people are engaging with each other, people are connecting with each other. And most important, there is a dynamic around the fact that there is a lot more freedom in the how and a lot more focus on the what. Organizations in their conversations, and this could be legal entities, and legal entities could be headquarters and a plant. It could be people within that group. Basically, are more focused on, okay, you need in your house, in your context, in your world, in your district, in your context, you know best what's happening. I don't know, but this is what needs to be done. How do you think you can get it done? What help do you need? The tone of conversation has changed dramatically. So there is also a pressure getting built up on the parts of employees. We are also hearing a lot of get it done, get it done, get it done. A lot more of outcome focus, a lot more of action focus. These are some things that are happening around us. In which case, what do we need of our leaders? This was a study conducted by getting most global leaders in the, especially in the area of culture together. And some of the key findings were not surprising. Listen with empathy. You guys nailed it in that earlier whole EV where you said, I need empathetic leaders. Absolutely right. You need to listen with empathy, but don't stop there. Also make sure that you're figuring out, you're measuring, you have a number, you have an idea, you have a metaphor, you have a yardstick, you have some way of saying, this is where we are and this is where we need to go from here. Because it's not just a crisis, but the crisis and after. We cannot go back to the before crisis. Whatever we are, whichever team we are, whichever organization we are, things are not going to be the same again. And we don't know when we are done with the change. So have the conversation. And for that conversation, you are going to engage in negotiation, renegotiation. You have to engage with your organization and ask, I can't do this, can I do that? Remobilization is something that most organizations are working there. I'm not going to say struggling with, but they're working their way through and they're not sure how it's going to land. Because people in the meanwhile have already gone on to their next normal, which is I'm working from home, I'm good. Getting them back to the workplace is something that we're still working on. So this is where we are in terms of what kind of organizational behaviors are we seeing at this point in time. They are constructive, they are positive, but they need to be nurtured, they need to be groomed. We need leaders to take us to the next step. Before I go further, here is my ask of you. Can you go ahead and capture on a sheet of paper that you have? Just take a minute, capture in that sheet of paper, what do you see as some issues that are surfacing? I would like it to be organization-wide, but perhaps it's at a team level. I don't know at what level you are, so org or team. And the other part is when we talked about leadership needs to do this, and we had the chart that talked about being empathetic, being constructive, looking for data, looking for innovative ideas, being willing to listen, being willing to talk. We talked about all those attributes. Which do you think your leaders will struggle with the most? I'll give you 40 seconds on this. In the meanwhile, Sudeshna, are there any early questions?
Yeah, a couple, and maybe you take one of them at least. So it's written that leader, like in your, it's a question like in your experience, how often do you think leaders do take into account cognitive diversity, and how important it is to take account of cognitive diversity?
So it is very important, and I'm going to demonstrate shortly after this. The first part, how often do leaders, forget leaders, how often do we do it? There's a set of culture, but I say this of cognitive diversity also. Uh, there are two fish. There's a fish that's swimming. Another fish comes to it and says, how's the water today? The first fish looks at this fish very blankly and says, what is water? Culture, to that extent, cognitive diversity also are like water. You really cannot discern them. Cognitive diversity among the various kinds of diversity is probably the most invisible often all. It's not easily seen. Let me prove that to you. I'm going to take you back to Paul EV. I have listed a bunch of different kinds of diversity topics. I would like you to rank them. What should be on screen is an ability for you to rank them. Can you rank them? Can you at least make sure that your whichever ones you think are important for you are in the top 3? As you tap on them, their levels should go up and down.
In your screen, you will see, like, you will have these very many topics, and you will have a up and down arrow to the left. You need to just, whichever ones you want them to be ranked on top, you need to take it up with the, push it with the up arrow.
This is in your organization. Which topic do you think is most important? And while you're looking through it, again, my request is look for the top 2-3 things that you see as critical. Thank you. Socioeconomic status and ethnicity. In a different context, we would have probably said ethnicity/race, and that could also be an important one. Gender and age are typically very, very visible. Right? Going back to the question of why don't people see it? Well, it's not the only kind of diversity there is. And most of the time, we assume that our hiring strategy takes into account all of this stuff. Right? It helps us figure out what's right, what's wrong. But I'm finding it very interesting that this team collectively thinks that ways of thinking is the first item. That's pretty cool.
Krish, there is a related question in this regard, is that the person is saying, is it my ignorance, or we consider gender diversity and age or socioeconomic as the ones which we take into account maybe while addressing any kind of a diversity in the organization, but how many organizations really take way of thinking as or way of thinking or cognitive diversity as very important?
No, you're perfectly fair. That's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. There's a need for heightened awareness around it. Because, and here's the killer, cognitive diversity, that ways of thinking, affects how we look at the other diversities. If my preference is to be looking more at data, I'm going to say, okay, I want to target 30% of X people in my team. I've hit 30%, I'm happy. Whereas if I've got a more empathetic preference, I'm going to say, I don't care whether it's 30% or 10%. How do the people who come in feel? If I've got more a preference about procedure, I'm going to be focusing on, okay, we've got them on board, but what is the procedure on which they onboarded? What kind of jobs can they do? What kind of jobs can't they do? How will we manage this? What are we differentiating in terms of policies? And if I've got a more of a conceptual preference, a more preference around new novel ideas, I'm going to say, are we doing the most coolest stuff? Are they doing something more cool than that? How can we spend more money on this and make this different? Our cognitive diversity is going to affect how we deal with other diversities. It is invisible. It is difficult to touch. You're perfectly right. Great question. And when we ask this question to a larger research group and ask, how does this whole thing work? They said the same thing you guys did, that ways of thinking definitely comes up top. Gender, age definitely come among the top 5. But ways of thinking definitely makes a difference. And here's the interesting bit. In terms of employee engagement, the ways of thinking contributes the most to employee engagement of all the other diversities. The way to read this graph is to say that when it is there, 79% engagement. When it's not there, 59% engagement. The gap is highest for ways of thinking. So it's difficult to track, perhaps difficult to measure, but its effect is obvious to everyone. You've been in a meeting where someone's not allowed you to talk. One person keeps talking and you're like, I want to get my words in. I want to hear my words spoken. That is also part of what we describe as cognitive diversity. We're going to discuss that a little later when I talk about a metaphor for diversity. So again, ask for you. My request is when you think of these diversities, the different topics that we just called out, yes, the agreed ways of thinking is important, but I would still request you to capture one or two of them as being important to you. Which of them resonate really with you, which made you say, damn, that one is important. I never thought about it. Capture that and ask yourself, what would that look like in your team? What do you want to achieve in that? Let's say age diversity caught your eye. What do you want to do in the next 1 year, next 6 months, next 3 months around that topic? It's an ask for you. And with that in our mind, we focus on cognitive diversity. What is that animal? Essentially, we are saying we need that ability for people to look at things from different lenses. Going back to that Apple example, going back to that email example, I cannot afford for everyone to look at it and say, that's an apple in chorus. No, I need someone to say, maybe that's an orange, beaten up, weird shape. Maybe that's a pear, the upside down. I need people to have different points of view on it. And as they process on whether it should be consumed or not, I need different points of view. If the discussion is how are we going to package, I need different points of view. And that needs both a distance and a depth to the conversation. From an emergenetics perspective, as we looked at this area, and emergenetics is an organization that focuses on thinking and human behavior. It's derived, unlike other profiling tools, it's derived more from the neuroscience world. Roger Sperry's Nobel laureate winning discovery of the corpus callosum of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, it's derived from there. And that's the metaphor I'm going to take you through. And as emergenetics worked in this area, the message was fairly clear. Cognitive diversity gives you far more in terms of outcomes. I know they've run into the HBR study. It made quite a splash when it turned up 2017. It's talked about the fact that when you give teams tough problems to solve, the more diverse teams, the more cognitively diverse teams solve the problem faster. The rest weren't able to. And it has effect on decreasing risk. It brings more people. It helps you to co-opt people into changes. It helps you to build consensus. It helps you to decrease risk. Deloitte says 30% of risk drops. Deloitte also says there's 20% improvement in innovation. There's a lot of research in this area. Question for you. Who in your life brings you cognitive diversity? This is a personal question. I'm asking you to write down on a sheet of paper. Who in your life brings that different thought process to you? Friend, family, colleague? And proceeding from that, my ask, now that we know what this animal called cognitive diversity is, my ask is maybe capture that on a sheet of paper. And on this particular one, the person who's bringing you the cognitive diversity, tell them, go back and tell them that you bring this something special in my life. I know we're venturing past the organizational storyline, but this is important for your own development. Sudeshna, any question I can take?
The same thing on cognitive diversity. Is there any right mix or wrong mix, or is there a way to get what is the right mix for a cognitive diversity for a particular organization? Is there any indicators?
So now I'm going to take you into the metaphor, right? Into how we actually work with the organization to develop this, right? The metaphor, the thought process around cognitive thinking from an emergenetics perspective, I took you to the culture storyline to measure culture and assess culture. But then when I come back to cognitive diversity and I want to bring in diversity as a number and I want to practice it, the way we do it is call out these numbers through an assessment. We find out from the organization what are their preferences on these various fronts. We look at 7 attributes together. 3 of them are to do with behavior. 3 of them are to do with how people like to engage, express. Do they have a filter? They don't have a filter as they speak with the world. How do they like to assert? How do they like to, what is the pace? What is the style in which they push forward their thoughts and opinions and feelings? And finally, how do they deal with change? How do they deal with stuff? And that's actually why we also bring this up when we do change management projects. We bring this up to get a sense for where stakeholders are. And then we focus on thinking preferences. And thinking preferences cover a data-oriented, logic-oriented preference. It also covers a preference for processes, a preference for a gut feel for people and engaging with people, and finally a preference for both the big picture as well as new, innovative, different ideas. And where is the metaphor in this whole story? I mean, am I asking you to memorize 7 of them? No. Left brain, right brain. Left brain focusing on analytical and structural thinking, more about data, more about process. Right brain focusing on people and new, novel, innovative ideas. And around them are these 3 behaviors we're talking about: expressive, assertive, flexibility. Because guess what? When people run into us, they see our behaviors first. This is our metaphor. This is our short form for thinking about cognitive diversity. Don't believe me? Let's go back to your data that you shared. Look at what you said. Metaphorically, you're saying, I like left brain, but I would love to have more of right brain in this context. And that is this group, and that is a subset of this group, those of you who chose to answer. This doesn't represent every one of you in this conversation. But of those who chose to answer, you prefer more right brain than left brain. If you look at it, you prefer more people who are engaged and who are engaged, who are driving, who would like to get things done, but are open to ideas and are willing to flip if required, and who will speak up and tell us what they're thinking. You asked a question on why isn't this focused on, but here's the challenge, right? We tend to ask for the behaviors that we ourselves like. Making a fair bet that those who did respond to this can also connect with what I just said. They would like to be transparent and engage and communicate a lot. They would like to call out issues and bring it up to the forefront and nail them. They would like to engage and think about, hey, that decision is not final. Let's open it up and have another conversation. Perhaps it describes you, perhaps it doesn't. But like every other thing we know on the bias front, like tends to like. We tend to hire people that we like. We spend time. That's why I asked you the question, who in your life brings you cognitive diversity? We tend to typically engage with people like us. That's one more reason why cognitive diversity is tough to achieve, because we don't get to see it unless someone else walks in, another goldfish walks in and says, where is the water? When someone new comes in and someone says, you guys go to the same place every week? That's when we say, yeah, actually we do in the pre-COVID world. So as a metaphor, the reason why we went through this metaphor is to understand how this whole game works. Why is this metaphor important to us? It's important to us because in context of crisis, and I want to go back to the whole topic of decision making, right? From a decision making perspective, there's stress involved because people are dealing with uncertainty. They don't have all the facts. And these different preferences, that's why the metaphor was important. They have different needs. They want different things. They display their stress in different forms. So analytical preference is probably going to be more focused on why are you saying this? What is the data? We need to know what else has happened. Who else is doing it? Your structural preference is going to say, no, show me the 4 houses. Who's going to go when? What is the sequence in which we're going to do it? Can we afford it? Where is the permissions? Where is the approvals? Your social preference is going to focus more on who is getting affected. What are they thinking? And there's going to be friction sometimes because the social preference is going to say that person is struggling, and the analytical preference is going to say that's 1% out of 100. That's fine. And social preference is going to say no, that 1% is important. And in the meanwhile, the conceptual preference is going to say, what else should we be doing? Let's look at the big picture. Let's step back. This is probably not going in the right direction. And there are behavioral preferences in the game. In times of stress, your people who prefer to express less are going to be needing space and quiet to think. They're going to hate this kind of conversation. Whereas the rest are going to want to engage and talk and have more meetings and engage and have that chat. Some are going to say, let's decide on something and move. Let's make the first step forward. But there's no urgency. It's all right. Let the situation develop. Whereas some others are going to say, no, we need to lead the pack. We need to act on it right now. And finally, from a flexibility perspective, some are going to say, We decided this 3 meetings back. Why aren't we still focused on it? And someone else is going to say, situation changed, boss. We need to do something else. Effectively, I'm saying under times of stress, our preferences are going to be strongly demonstrated. They're going to kick in really, really hard. Are you observing these? Are you seeing any of them? And if you are, our next question becomes, how do you engage with this? How do you make it work? Because it's likely that you're not yet in a shape where everyone is on the same page. You don't yet have cognitive diversity. You don't have a mix. So the question was, what is a mix, Krish? And the answer is, a mix is not within one person, but it's among a group. And so long as we have an even distribution among the group, we are safe. But here's the beautiful part of it. Even if I didn't have a preference for analytical thinking, I do have the capability of doing analytical thinking. It's just on my preference. When I'm put into the position, I would rather find out who's around me rather than how many people there are, right? But if you ask me later how many were there, I can give you that answer too. When you ask me to file my income tax returns, I am going to be looking at my data, which means I have the capacity to engage on a cognitive level by asking questions. If I know that as a leadership team, as a group, we are weak on setting numbers and chasing them down, we can ask these questions in a group. What are the goals? What are the things that we chase? If we know that we are struggling, say, with the social preference, we are very task focused and we get stuff done one after another. Perhaps the question is, so let's assume the end users in the room, what are they thinking? And sometimes I've seen the conversation come to a stop because people struggle with the question. It's not their natural preference, but they are able to engage. They're able to give the time for it. Let's say their preference is more to be talking. Ask the question. We haven't heard anything from that person. Guys, can we think for a couple of minutes before we say yes to this? Sometimes inviting teams to go quiet has helped. And finally, let's say we are an organization that jumps for the next new idea as it comes along. Just have a good project plan. Just have a dashboard. I've seen that make a difference. The interesting part about cognitive diversity is it's not that you need to have it and people need to be born with it. Sometimes you can evoke it. Structure sometimes is going to help you bring it onto the table. Because we're in time of crisis and you can't go around hiring people for that reason. It's probably not kosher to do that. It's more about bringing that up to the forefront. If there's one person who's a talker and everyone else is a listener, you got to let this person have the mic once in a while. And that brings us to the question on which of these questions do you think are not asked in your organization, in those meetings? What's one question among this that you would like to really, really take and go back with? While you think about that, a couple of inputs from my side is I just want to bring up a couple of examples, a few examples that we've been going through. One such example has been in the case of an organization that's in FMCG. And the challenge was huge amount of friction among the plants from a manufacturing perspective. Because as you can guess, transportation is a challenge, logistics is a challenge, inventory planning, PPC is a challenge, raw material planning is a challenge. Everything has been very, very, very messy. And this is an organization that does things by the numbers. And what they had been doing was focus just on the numbers and then come up with a bunch of action plans that were being rolled out. And they were being rolled out. We had this cognitive diversity conversation. And the two things that came out of it is the leadership looking at each other and saying, damn, the only language we talk is numbers. We don't talk any other language. We don't talk market, we don't talk customer, we don't talk employees, we don't talk people. And we have never ever shared what we are freaked out about. What we are freaked out about in this room, we're not shared with the larger group. And that was a risky conversation because in a plant environment, in a manufacturing environment, you can't call out all the vulnerabilities at one shot to a larger mixed of the audience, but it got them starting to think. And the next thing they said is, how are our employees living their lives right now? How many of them have the same belief we have about the future of the organization? And these came because of an insistence that we need to think from a cognitive diversity perspective. The questions that I just talked to you about now, asking those questions. What are we not thinking about? What are we not listening? What do we have no information about? And is that okay that we have no information about what's happening in this area and that area? The second example I had is a tech organization, and everything is going smooth. Going back to that question on numbers and data, when we did this survey, the Emergenetics survey, and we came back to them with the data. We done the culture survey, then we did the Emergenetics survey. The culture survey said that this organization is very, very task focused. The Emergenetics survey said it's very, very left brained. It's all about tasks and people. And here's the killer. The organization realized that it was not just the top level, but the next level, and then the level below them. They were all focused just on getting things done. And they looked at each other and said, wow, we really do hire people like us, don't we? The third example I have is an organization that is more government organization. It's a PSU. Technically PPP, but run more like a PSU. And in their case, as they were going through a fairly dramatic change, the issue was they were more people focused. Don't rock the boat. Hierarchy speaks. Connect with the right people. And we got a mixed group of people in the room. And guess what they bonded over? They bonded over the fact that of all the things that you told us about the cognitive diversity, that analytical stuff, we can relate to it a lot. There is no one thing that all of us chase. And since it was, we facilitated it to be as informal as possible, it was beautiful for them to come up with just the one thing. And they said, that's not threatening. We're not going to what that one thing was. It's specific to that organization in that context. But that's just that one thing. And we're going to chase that number. And anytime we are in conversation, as we bring up that number, it makes us all nod. And there's a mixed group, right? There's union, there's labor, there's all the things that you can expect in a government context, including a focus on outcomes. This is real. Cognitive diversity is an important thing. It is real. And if we don't do this well, we will always struggle with the fact that somehow we finish that meeting, but we are left with something that's not what we wanted. I think about 6, 7, 8 minutes away from closure. In the spirit of making sure that you do take away something from this, can you go back to poll EV and tell me one thing that you think you're going to take away from this conversation? And Sudeshna, while they are thinking about one takeaway that they have out of this 1 hour, any questions that I can answer?
Okay, please kind of, I would, I'm putting up the feedback thing, and so that, you can leave us with your feedback as well for this session.
That's good feedback, but there is nothing to take away from this webinar. Sudeshna, if you're switched on feedback anyway, yes. Then I'm still going back to my question to you. Any Q&A that you have that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so here is that, do leaders have any kind of always this cognitive diversity in teams we are to think about, or do leaders also, leadership teams need to have the diversity, cognitive diversity as well?
My focus in this conversation was all about leadership teams. So the reason why the leadership, it needs to be top-down, it needs to be across the organization. We address cognitive diversity at team level too, but invariably what happens is a team gets localized benefits out of it, but as they start engaging with the larger organization, culture comes into play. As they start working with the rest of the organization says, no, it's all about tasks. Give me the data, give me the data, give me the data. Things start getting iffy. So it is an organization-wide movement. This topic for me was about cognitive diversity during crisis, and that definitely belongs to the leadership level. Should be addressed at the team level, but it needs support from the top. That makes sense, Sudeshna?
Yeah, it does.
Anything else that's on the table?
There is one more, is like, in leaders, do you see a specific trait in your experience? Like, do leaders tend to have a particular, or is it necessary for leaders to have a combination of the thinking preferences and the behavior preferences we?
That's a very good question. our data in MARG in India, especially as we see, as we work with more and more organizations, we do see a trend. Trend is probably a strong word. I see leaders seeming to have more of a database preference as well as a strategic, big picture based preference on the thinking side, as well as being more forceful, more communicative, and welcoming change. I'm seeing that as a more typical profile. So I'm visualizing an interview, and if a person is on the quiet side, I'm not very sure how that interview lands. If the person is not able to speak big picture and they're speaking only processes, I'm not sure how they are received. It looks like corporate India seems to have a preference for leaders who can talk big picture, who can talk data, who can talk, and who can be decisive, and who are very, very comfortable with flipping ideas here and there. So I'm not calling that out as a, that's why I said I don't want to call it a trend, but I'm seeing that profile emerge more often. Should it be that way? Again, as I'm describing, there is no bad profile or good profile. We're all brilliant. We're all perfect. That's nothing to do with it. It's just a question of, given the fact that as a leader, my work involves a lot of tasks covering all those preferences. Do I have, as an individual or as a group, people I can go to resolve those issues? That's the question we seek to answer. So Vishnu, we are approaching the top of the hour. If there weren't any more questions, I have one comment to make.
Yeah, do we kind of answered this question, but still, like, in times of crisis, which quality do you think is foremost for a leader?
I don't know the nature of the crisis. If you're in a nuclear plant and the nuclear plant has just gone into alarm signals.
We give it from the perspective of a pandemic. I mean, we consider it during this time.
I'm sorry, I still think that any one set of preferences may be insufficient to meet something which has as many boundary conditions as the one that we're going through. I would still need a leadership team, what we call a V team, a team that has multiple preferences available. I need leadership team to be able to look at the incoming data and make decisions. And while making these decisions, be as empathetic as possible, take people along and look for different ways in which we can innovate along the way. And all of this needs to be done in a fair fashion, in a way that's systematic, which means I need a lot of structure preferences. So as a leadership team, I'm sorry, I need all the preferences.
And maybe quality by quality, I think if it is not a preference we are talking about, it may be a leadership attribute if the question is meant to have. Maybe
if I broaden it past what we have described, I need leaders to be engaged. I need leaders to understand their role and not just work from their title. It's not about the title at this point. It's about the fact that the leader needs to lead people to a vision. So I would say some of the attributes I would look for in a leader is that they're able to call out, this is where the next stage is. This is where we're taking you to. One thing that I would ask leaders to do at this point is build trust and sustain trust. That's the one thing that is absolutely critical during this times of crisis. So don't break trust. I've seen leaders who are setting up calls and then sitting on the call every day saying, I don't have fresh information, but every day 2 p.m. I'm going to be on this call. Anyone can come in and ask me whether I have any fresh information. So in terms of an action, I would say continue to build trust and sustain the trust. In terms of an attribute, I would say be conscious of the fact that you're leaders because you're leading people, that you're leading them somewhere, and that their faith in you is now much higher than it ever was. That makes sense to you, Solution?
Yeah, it does. Okay, so it is 1 p.m. and we are towards the end, absolutely, of the hour of our webinar. So thank you everybody for joining this one. And this topic particularly is very close to our heart because it is cognitive diversity, and that's what we have always given preference in our own organization. Because we feel if we achieve cognitive diversity, the other diversities should fall in place. So kindly, I hope you are left with the thought that this is important and try to bring in that diversity in your teams and your organizations. So thank you everybody for joining us. Have a great day. Stay safe.